One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you a conversation from our popular webinar series. Professor Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Laureate and former Chief Economist of the World Bank, and here he talks to the Australia Institute about the role of government in the modern economy. He was in conversation with the Australia Institute's Chief Economist, Richard Denniss. Professor Stiglitz is currently visiting Australia as a guest of the Australia Institute, and this was recorded live on Monday the 11th of July 2022, and things may have changed since recording. So governments around the world and here in Australia are currently negotiating rising inflation, cost of living pressures, rising interest rates, and expectations to deliver high quality public services. Here in Australia, we are managing historically low wages growth, underemployment, and rising inequality as well. And that's before we even touch on big economic issues like climate change impacts and rising inequality. Today's topic is the role of government in the modern economy. And of course, the pandemic and before that, the global financial crisis has really shown us that governments can and should play a major role in the economy. And so to discuss that in depth today, I'm delighted to introduce our special guest, Nobel Prize Laureate economist, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. He's the president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University and chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He's a recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, the John Bates Clark Medal, and of course, the Sydney Peace Prize here in 2018. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and author of several books, including the recent People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. Professor Stiglitz is currently visiting Australia as a guest of the Australia Institute, and today he will be in conversation with our chief economist, Richard Denniss. Richard is the former executive director of the Australia Institute and our current chief economist. He's a prominent economist, author, and public policy commentator here in Australia. And he's also the author of several books, including Econobabble and Big, the Role of the State in the Modern Economy. Richard, thank you so much. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for joining us. Richard, I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, thanks, Ebony, and thanks, Joe. Welcome to Australia. You've been here for a week or so now. How does the Australian economic conversation differ to what you see in other countries, or does everyone just ask you about interest rates?
Well, it does differ from that in the United States. It's a little bit more civil. America is engaged in a new civil war, and it's hard to have a rational conversation about what is going on. And so for me, it's been a real pleasure to be here, where I think more thought is being brought to these issues, especially at this time, because you mentioned there's a new government. And so it's an opportunity to think about which direction Australia should go.
Well, I think a lot of people today will be surprised to hear you think the Australian debate is civil, because for the past 10 years, it's been rather forceful. But yeah, I think you've come at a great time. Look, at the Australia Institute, we try to take good economic theory and turn it into practice. And you won the Nobel Prize for talking about information asymmetry, that when not everyone knows the same things, markets don't always work so well. You and so many other good economists have pointed out that reducing inequality is good for the economy, that reducing market power is good and competition is good for the economy. Yet so many people think that if we're hard on poor people and if we're kind to big companies, that's the way to help the economy. So there's no theory behind that, but why is this? Why is it so easy to be mean to the vulnerable and nice to the powerful? And how come economics gets used to justify that?
Well, it's not surprised that those who are in a position of power, which disproportionately are people of wealth, use that wealth and power to make up arguments that serve themselves. I mean, I don't find anything surprising about that. I find it a little bit disappointing that so many economists join them in that effort. The critical point here is that these are issues that have been debated for more than 200 years. Adam Smith, who is the founding father of economics, is often cited for one of his insights, which was sometimes called the invisible hand, which says that the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of everybody in society. And that is the kind of argument that those people on the right that you were referring to often use. The interesting thing is Adam Smith didn't believe it. He explained why you need a large role of government. He explained that whenever firms get together, they conspire against the public interest to create monopolies that could exploit people. He also explained how whenever they can, they get together in secret. It's actually interesting. He talked about secrecy here to suppress wages of workers. So he saw all the conflict that was going on. Now, he was writing before the modern age of science and industry. So he was picking up a little bit of what was going on in a relatively primitive commercial agriculture economy. And all the forces that he talked about that were a worry to him, why markets wouldn't work, have played out enormously. Moreover, there was one thing that he never really crystallized in the way that modern economics has, which is the importance of externalities. And we've just been through one big episode of externalities, the pandemic. If I have the disease and I go to work in public space, it increases the probability of you're getting the disease or you're dying. Climate change is another big externality. These are core of modern life today. And finally, there were two other things that those ideas, or three other things that were left out. One he actually thought about. One of them is, I mentioned, the asymmetries that you mentioned, asymmetries of information, which mean that markets don't work quite as perfectly as those who pretend that they do. And where that's important is imperfect information gives rise to the potential for exploitation, people taking advantage of other people's ignorance. When we think about the opioid crisis, the childhood diabetes crisis caused by the food industry, you go through the whole list of the financial crisis. All those were really based on a lot of asymmetries of information. People would not have done these things if they fully knew what was going on. So that was one thing that he was not fully cognizant of. But the second thing he didn't fully take into account, because he was just at the beginning of modern science. And the reason we have a higher standard of living today is because of science. Science is production of science is knowledge. It's a public good. And all the basic advances in science have been publicly funded, from the internet to the mRNA platform for vaccines. We can go on the whole list. And so a strong public sector is really important for our well-being. And finally, the concept of market failure that we talk about all the time now was not crystallized. He talked about it a little bit, but the particular market failures I'm referring to is that poor, ordinary people often can't provide for the education and health of their children. And if these children don't get adequate health and education, they're not going to turn out to be productive members, as productive as they could be in society. So actually, a small government harms growth.
Well, I agree. And in Australia, we're seeing the debate begin to catch up. But I guess, it's decades since economists like yourself, literally won the Nobel Prize for pointing it out. Our policymakers lag. I've heard you laugh that the thing about the invisible hand is we can't see it because it's not there. There seems to be so much, people, I guess the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's famous book, it's a bit like the Bible. People talk about it, but they don't really read it. And there's all those chapters in there that people don't want to deal with. How do you think in the US, in Australia, how do you think the role of government is going to change in coming decades, not just because of climate change and COVID, which are acute, but everything from Facebook and Google, there are new opportunities as well as new threats. Do you think government's going to get bigger or smaller to cope with these things?
Well, let me first say that I think we're at a critical moment, because it's been 40 years that the doctrines of what are sometimes called neoliberalism, small government, have dominated. Since the era of Thatcher and Reagan were so influential around the world, Milton Friedman in academia. We've had an experiment, you might call it that, for 40 years. 40 years is a long time. And if you think about capitalism only being 240 years, it's a sixth of the life of capitalism.
It's good data.
It's good data. And we now know that has failed. Growth is lower than the era that preceded it. And a disproportionate share of that limited growth went to the people at the top. People at the bottom are actually worse off. Things are worse in the United States than they are in Australia. You may complain, but you're looking across the Pacific, wages adjusted for inflation at the bottom of the United States are at the same level as they were 65 years ago. This is the most prosperous large country in the world. Life expectancy has been on decline. So, it's very clear that system has failed. And people are becoming increasingly aware that the economy is not resilient. The market economy is supposed to be able to produce goods. In the COVID-19, we couldn't produce simple products like masks or protective gear, let alone complicated products like ventilators and tests. And now we are having monkeypox. And again, the private sector can't produce the tests that we need. And we're seeing it in the ability to respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the market is not resilient, doesn't manage risk well. We saw that in the 2008 crisis, where we needed a massive government bailout, or the whole market system would have collapsed. And the irony was, it was those people in finance who argued that the market was resilient and could take care of itself that came pleading for help in the magnitude of $1 trillion.
Well, Paulson introduced the regulations that, that's what he done and gone for.
So, and then finally, I think there, with the tech giants, there's an awareness of market power. And it's just not just the tech giants. I don't know if you read about the shortage of baby formula in the United States, where mothers were desperate to find baby formula. You know why that happened? It was because one company that had 50% of the baby formula market was unsafe and had to shut down. And we didn't have a diversified production system.
It's as if monopoly and concentration led to concentration of risk.
Exactly. So I think there's a beginning of an awareness that we don't have a competitive market, free market economy. We have a monopoly exploitive economy that depends a lot on government subsidies in certain areas, and the result of that is that a beginning of thinking about, well, how can we reshape our economy to make it serve better our citizens in so many ways, not only material goods, but working conditions that we live in, the way that they've been exploiting our workers. We have these things called split schedules and just-in-time scheduling, just terrible for ordinary people's lives.
Well, on that, because I've heard you say a number of times that, and we should talk about language. In the US, the Chicago School, the kind of neoliberal sort of economists, that's where they started off. And in Australia, we used to call that economic rationalism. But in the US, I've heard you say that the Chicago School's real success was kind of getting their economic ideas written into the rules, written into the laws. So our competition policy in Australia was very influenced by it. The ACCC, our consumer watchdog, does a good job, but the laws it implements were laws kind of crafted in the shadow of that Chicago School. So do you think that those, we'll call them right-wing economists, do you think they were just better at building institutions to amplify their ideas? You know, because the ideas are long kind of dismissed, but the institutions are still there. And if so, what do progressive institutions look like? What do we need to build, not just think, in order to take things forward? Do we need to go back to wage fixing? Do we need to, what bodies do we need to provide lasting force?
Well, people like Milton Friedman were good economists, but they were even better propagandists. And he knew that what mattered in the long run was the rules. And so he succeeded, for instance, in writing a very influential paper in 1970 in the New York Times about shareholder capitalism.
One of the better economic journals, you mean.
Yeah. And he argued that the objective of firms should be to maximize shareholder value, and anything else was a crime. And then many states in the United States and many countries around the world adopted that. Now, I was writing around the same time, proving that that was not true. And unfortunately, I published in places like the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the Journal of Finance. But I got to admit, he had more influence. I showed that what he was arguing was not good economics, and we actually had occasions where we had face-to-face debate, and I think I won.
You won.
But the fact of the matter was that he won because he got it into legislation. Now, I've done 2 books with groups of people in Europe and America, one of them called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, in other words, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, and talking about the fact that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by rules and regulations, and we have to rethink all the rules and regulations. So we have to go from corporate governance laws that say you have to maximize shareholder value to one that say you have to take into account all the stakeholders, workers, communities, environment, customers. But that's just one example. Fiduciary responsibility laws governing that, competition laws. One of the problems is the competition laws were written under the influence of Chicago, where the belief was that markets were naturally competitive, and the burden of proof was placed on anybody trying to say, well, this is
to intervene.
Where, as I look out, and data is so overwhelming, that in so many markets it's so clear that there is market power. And the antitrust authorities didn't go after baby formula markets. They didn't go after lots of other examples that we could talk about because the laws make it very, very hard. So we have to change the presumptions. We have to be aware of the way that market power gets exercised, often in very, very subtle ways. And, people don't realize the extent of the exploitation. I gave the example in the foods that lead to childhood diabetes, in financial products. But there are so many, they don't realize how they're being cheated on airline reservations, on credit cards, on, you name it. And almost certainly there's some kind of exploitation going on. Consumers are beginning to feel that. They say, in America, we broke up AT&T, one company, and we wound up with two. And people say, what choice do I have? In most places, there's still only one. But even if I have two, they're equally bad. And so if you get discontent with one, if you switch to the other, you'll be equally discontent because there's not the competition the kind of service that you would have thought in a highly competitive market.
Yeah, and I've heard you say in the US, and I think most Australians would be surprised about this, that there are even big companies putting restrictions on their workers' ability to go and work for their competitors. So non-compete clause, you've said, actually apply to people working in the fast food industry.
That's right.
How does that work? No one in Australia has heard of this.
Yeah, well, these are, I mentioned Adam Smith talked about how the subtle ways in which employers work to drive wages down. Well, that's what they're doing in the fast food industry in the United States. Wages, by the way, are not that great. They're, $8, $9, $10 an hour. And, you can't live on that, particularly in a place like New York. And the non-compete clauses mean that the supply of labor to the competition of one guy against the other is very limited, because if I work at McDonald's, I can't be hired by Burger King because there's a non-compete clause. So our antitrust authorities are trying to figure out how within these laws that were not well designed for 21st century monopoly, monopsony, how they can try to attack the problems. And the underlying difficulties we haven't come to is the political system, and so hard, at least in America, to change the legal frameworks, which is where we ought to be beginning. But with one of the two parties totally in the pocket of business, very hard to get the legislation that we need.
So in Australia, and the Australian Institute of Research has shown this, we've got real wages falling, we've got profits at record share of GDP, and now that we've imported some inflation, mainly in the form of higher energy prices, people instantly go to a wage price spiral, and sort of workers driving up prices. And if we gave low paid workers a pay rise to keep up with the cost of living, they would be causing inflation. So instantly, as soon as inflation arrived, even after a decade of low wage growth, we've blamed low paid workers. So is this the case in America? Are workers being blamed for inflation over there?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. But as you were suggesting, you look at the data, it's clearly not the case. Wages are not even keeping up with prices. So when we look at that, wages are a dampener on inflation. And I feel very strongly, I've been advocating governments ought to be helping lower and middle income people deal with inflation that is going on. But if you ask what are the sources of inflation, it's clear that much of it is what you call imported inflation. It's inflation with energy prices, with food prices. And the idea that raising interest rates is going to solve the problem, I think, is a fantasy. Raising interest rates doesn't make more oil, doesn't make more food. There'll still be high global oil and food prices unless you get a really good global recession. And then, of course, low wages adjusted for inflation are bad, but no wages, i.e. unemployment, is even worse.
Yeah.
So the other aspect, we've had some studies at the Roosevelt Institute that have highlighted the fact that those sectors, roughly the sectors of the economy, where there's more market power is indicated by higher markups. The sectors where inflation is higher.
Yeah.
So
Who'd have thought?
It would have thought, yeah. So in fact, it seems to be going on, and there's some economic theory, a little complex, but economic theory that supports this, that they're firms with market power are using the opportunity of the current turmoil to raise prices even more. So what we really need, I think, right now to deal with inflation are, for the medium run, some supply side measures. What can we do to increase the supply of labor? What can we do to resolve some of the other bottlenecks that we have in the economy? And then the second thing we need to do is more medium term, but it will start having an effect right away. Better competition policy. Better competition will drive some of those high prices down. One of the real ironies in the American situation is that you look at energy prices, one of the big sources of inflation. U.S. is close to energy neutral. And what does that mean? That means when the energy prices go up, the country as a whole is neither better off nor worse off, because we're not importing or exporting. But that increase in the price of energy results in a transfer of wealth, of income, from ordinary consumers to the oil companies and the oil and gas companies. Do they work for that? No. There was Russia invaded Ukraine. That's why the oil company is doing so well. So that's why we need a tax, a windfall profits tax on the oil and gas companies that are making off like bandits.
And you say you're talking about the US.
In the US.
Imagine you were an energy exporter, the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, the second largest exporter of coal. Usually energy exporting countries enjoy the benefits of high oil prices, yet here we are in Australia feeling poor, even though we're the third biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world. So I suspect you support a windfall profits tax for us here as well.
Even more strongly. And again, it's a redistribution from ordinary consumers to the producers. And the data that I've seen, I think some of it may be from the Australia Institute,
hopefully,
is that a disproportionate share of those companies are owned abroad. So that means the Australians, even though the energy, the resources should be Australian, should be owned by the Australian people.
Yep.
In fact, with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, you're transferring money out of the country to foreign investors. It makes no sense. I look at that.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, in Australia, we are importing price increases and exporting profits.
Exactly. It is mind-boggling that you are engaged in doing it, but you might say that's old politics.
Yeah. Well, one last question before we go to the audience, and it relates to this, is that our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, has recently proposed introducing a well-being framework for our budget, which would both include formally in the budgeting process what our objectives are from a well-being point of view, and include new non-financial measures to track progress. Now, you were commissioned by the French President Nicolas Sarkozy, along with one of my other favorite economists, Amartya Sen, to look into the limitations of GDP. So here we've finally got an Australian treasurer, saying, well, let's go down this path, instantly being mocked by the right for taking his eye off the main game. Having looked deeply into GDP as a measure of well-being, is it a good idea for the Australian government to broaden its framework?
Very much so. And we looked into both the flaws in the metrics of like GDP and why it was very important as a society to look beyond GDP. So, for instance, we were just talking about the transfer of profits abroad. That's an example where GNP would be, which is gross national product, how much are the citizens of the country getting, not how much goods are being produced
in the borders,
within the borders. And GDP was introduced, interestingly, just when globalization expanded, just when it became a worse measure of what was relevant for a country. A country cares about the well-being of its citizens, not how much goods are being produced. The other basic idea is that GDP can go up, but the well-being of the citizens could go down. And GDP has gone up every year in the United States. Our life expectancy is going down. The incomes of the people in the middle have stagnated. The bottom are going down. Anybody looking at the United States, you look at the infrastructure, things are not good. So the correlation between GDP and what you care about is very low.
But Elon Musk might be a trillionaire soon. That's got to be good, isn't it? That
it doesn't help ordinary citizens. We can say, Bill Gates can be doing well. Jeff Bezos can be doing well. But that doesn't tell you. That's all included in GDP. But it doesn't tell you how the ordinary citizen, we call it the median person in the middle, is doing, let alone, all those down below that. And it doesn't tell you anything about what's happening to the environment, health, so many sense of insecurity, anxiety. So there's so many dimensions to what most people think constitute a good society.
Yeah. What's the Kennedy quote about GDP?
Measures everything except that which is important.
Well, on that note, Ebony, I suspect there might be one, maybe even two questions from our audience in the box.
We just cracked 100 questions, and I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I have been trying to log them as we go through. We've got more than 2,100 people on the line with us. Thanks so much for joining us today. Joseph Stiglitz, the question that I want to start with is one here from Lachlan Kerwood McCall. He says, in your 2019 book, you endorsed a job guarantee, writing that in the 21st century America, we should recognize a new right, the right of every person able and willing to have a job if the market fails and fiscal and monetary policies fail. Can you talk about why a job guarantee is so important to replace the so-called natural rate of unemployment?
The notion is two ideas that I thought were very important. First, there are so many things that we need people to do. We need to make the green transition. Some people say we can't afford it. Well, the question is, we can't not afford to do it. And the question is, where do we get the resources? So we need labor for that. We need labor look at infrastructure for making sure everybody gets a good education, good health, so on. And there are people who want to work. If there is somebody who wants to work and there are these jobs to be done, it is a failure of our society not to provide them with a job. It's a failure of our economy. And we should admit that something is not working right.
It's the ultimate inefficiency.
And so that was the first point. I said, if there's that inefficiency, our responsibility as a society is to get rid of it. And that's where the job guarantee was important. But the second point is that for most people, not all, but for most people, work is an important part of their life. Fact that they're contributing to society, whether it's addressing climate change or helping somebody do something they couldn't do themselves, whatever they're doing, work is part of what gives meaning to life. And for somebody to want to work for society to say, oh, you don't have anything to contribute.
You're not skilled enough.
That's a failure of us as a society and is degrading, demeaning. So on both of those accounts, I think having that kind of work guarantee is important. I am hopeful that if we actually created a more competitive economy and got rid of some of these monopolies, that the market would do a better job in creating full employment. And also, if we did a better job with health and education for everybody, then the system on its own might produce the jobs for at least most people. If you look at where we fail most dramatically in getting full employment, it's some of the marginalized groups. When I say marginalized, those that have not been provided adequate education and health.
The next question that I've got relates, I think, particularly to the Australian context at the moment, with neoliberalism obviously dominating the economic debate here for the past couple of decades. We tend to focus a lot on reducing debt and deficit and cutting public spending. But I've got a question here from Andrew Plaza, who says, what are your thoughts on the revenue side of things, on the efficacy of inheritance taxes, wealth taxes in reducing widening wealth inequality? And how can governments deliver, this is a big question, how can governments deliver tax reform without losing the popularity of the voters?
Well, I think on the latter question, surveys in the United States show that most voters support higher taxation on wealth. They support a wealth tax. It's only within what we call the Beltway, inside Washington, D.C., which are the political people who have been overly influenced by money, by financial interest and moneyed interest that oppose it. And that's been one of the problems that the Biden administration has been facing. They read the polls, and the polls say 70% think we ought to have a wealth tax. You try to get that through Congress, it's really difficult. So they're trying to deliver what Americans want, but our political system is broken, I think. The answer to the first part of the question is, I think, actually, a good system of income and wealth taxes, more progressive income taxes. We have a lot of loopholes on capital gains, on lots of areas, particularly corporate income tax, but a better, more progressive income tax system and more progressive inheritance and wealth taxes would actually increase growth in the economy and create a kind of social solidarity that would actually enhance, to go back to the word, societal well-being. There are actually a number of studies that have been done at OECD and IMF that show that societies, economies in which there is more equality, grow faster. Easy to understand. In my book, The Price of Inequality, I explain a large number of reasons for which that is true. But the easiest one to understand is that in Australia, in the United States, those at the bottom are not getting the education that allows them to live up to their potential. So we are wasting some of our most valuable resource, our human resources.
And
Richard, is there anything you want to add there to the Australian context in particular?
Yeah, no, I was just going to chime in. I mean, Joe made reference before to some research that one of our researchers, David Richardson, did. It says, 97% of the oil and gas industry is foreign owned. So to me, it kind of blows my mind that in Australia, we can't win a populist public debate about imposing a tax on an industry that's causing your petrol price to go up, causing your energy price to go up, is overwhelmingly foreign owned. Like the idea that it has to be politically dangerous to impose a tax like that it kind of blows my mind. And it sort of shows how captured to some extent our debate has been over many decades by these industries. But I think they've overplayed their hands. And broadly, as with the US, I think in Australia, while the fear campaign from the right is always Labor governments want to tax the economy into oblivion, I think the debate has to be carefully managed. And I think it's easier for Labor to do this from government to say, look, we're not increasing your tax rate, we're closing their loopholes.
Yeah, and let me add just one more thing, which is some of the research I've done over the last 50 years has shown that well-designed, progressive, say, corporate profits taxes do not decrease investment. They are taxes on pure profits, on rents, really we call it rents. And so they can be the basis of important investments in people, infrastructure, technology, and increase in that way the productivity. I talked about how important that was for a 21st century economy without discouraging private investment.
And just, one last point. We did some research a few years ago pointing out that if you look at when neoliberalism fired up in Australia in the 90s, GDP per person was about the same as Norway back then. And ever since we became neoliberal, ever since we started cutting our taxes and cutting public spending, Norway's just got richer and richer, and we've lagged behind them. So there's clear empirical proof that higher tax countries have outperformed Australia during this long experiment. So we can look around the world and find clear evidence that, the idea that higher taxes will discourage labour market effort or discourage investment it's a very convenient, powerful fantasy, but there's no evidence.
That takes me from taxes to subsidies. The next question is from Jen Sinclair, and she asks, how can the Australian economy desist from fossil fuel subsidies in order to help halt the production and exploration of fossil fuels in an age of climate change and have a more sustainable economy? Could you talk to us a little bit about subsidies?
Well, this is one of the ironies of neoliberalism, which is that while it preached the notion of no intervention in the market, in practice, it didn't do that. And fossil fuel subsidies are one of the biggest examples, but every country has their own examples, sometimes in open subsidies, sometimes in hidden subsidies. Example in the United States, the financial sector derivatives were given preference over any other claimant in the process of bankruptcy. And that was a way of encouraging the derivatives. Now, why would you want to encourage a risky industry like that and discourage at the same time some more productive industries? Blows my mind. But the answer is that it would be of double value to get rid of those fossil fuel subsidies. I say double value. Those subsidies are destroying the atmosphere, leading to climate change, which dealing with climate change is costing you. You're having the floods, wildfires. We have hurricanes, tornadoes. I mean, these extreme events in the United States are costing us between 1% and 2% a year in our GDP to repair the damage. And the money that you save by not subsidizing them, and there are lots of hidden open subsidies, could be used more productively in so many ways. Investments in health, education, technology, research to make the economy more productive. So Australia loses, in multiple ways from these fossil fuel subsidies. And then to repeat what Richard said, the irony is, who is the beneficiary of the subsidies? Foreigners. Now, why would Australian taxpayers want to subsidize foreign owners? I
was hoping you could answer this question, Joe, because as many people on these webinars have heard me say for years, this makes no economic sense. But
it doesn't even make political sense. I mean,
That's reassuring. Like, it makes me happy that you can't see it. Ebony, let me just add that, in Australia, the same, you said it's ironic, Joe, that the neoliberals support subsidies for things they like. But yeah, the same group who worry about the cost of avoiding climate change never talk about the cost of experiencing climate change.
Oh, exactly. And it's huge. These kinds of hypocrisy has been there since the beginning of neoliberalism. I remember doing an early study of Reagan's trade policy. He talked about how important free trade and all that was. He had import controls on about 25% of all. One of the things he did was to threaten Japan. Either you put, quote, voluntary export restraints on your cars, or we impose tariffs. Now, is that a
free trade?
Free trade?
Yeah. Well, he insisted it be voluntary, so that sounds free.
Yeah, voluntary, like a guy with a gun at your head and says, "Give me your money." And he said, "Well, he did it voluntarily."
Mm-hmm. The Australia-US free trade agreement is 1,400 pages long. I always say I could write one in one page. There will be no restrictions on trade. The other 1,400 pages spell out all the agreed restrictions.
Exactly.
I will just say, if anyone is interested in that subject of fossil fuel subsidies, the Australia Institute has done some quite recent research on that, and we calculated that the combined state and federal subsidies to the fossil fuel industry are upwards of about $11.5 billion each year and have been growing. So not good news on that front. The next question that I've got is from Kate Crawford. She asks, how do you think the modern role of the media to spread and amplify disinformation has impacted on our economy, Joe?
Yeah, that is something I've been very, very concerned with. But let me just say, just step back, one of Australia's really, really negative contributions to the world, I know I shouldn't be saying this in a Australian blog, is Murdoch and Fox News. So Fox News, the evidence is unambiguous that it has real effects, and they have been very adverse. But those effects have been amplified, as you say, by what's been happening on social media and so forth. And the real concern is the growth of mis and disinformation. And it has economic, social effects. We've just been through a pandemic, and we've seen one of the dimensions of that, which is the anti-vaxxers and the growth of vaccine resistance. And, the fact of the matter is, if large fractions of people don't get vaccinated, the disease spreads. It's a remarkably good vaccine, better than most vaccines. And even if it's not perfect, it works to reduce the spread of the disease. And that's an example of what we call externalities. And the social media, by spreading that kind of mis and disinformation, has had a very negative externality, not only on the lives of the people and their well-being, but of course on the economy, because if people can't go to, they're sick, they don't work, and as long as the disease is so prevalent, it gives an opportunity for mutations. It can be more deadly and dangerous, contagious, and so forth. But mis and disinformation then affects every aspect of the running of our society and our economy. I think that has been part of the basis of the battle that we've been talking about between neoliberalism and the critics of neoliberalism. Fox News in the United States has a very devoted group of listeners, and they're told, N times a day that markets are perfect.
And progressive governments will ruin the economy. And, what did they come up with for, Medicare over there? Death panels, doctor death panels.
Yeah. And the level of misunderstanding. Famously, in one of the presidential debates, somebody raised their hand and said, "I want government to keep its hands off of my Social Security and Medicare."
Okay.
Fox News and these social media have been so successful in conveying the idea that anything that is successful had to be private, that they believe that these public programs that they depended on and loved had to be private.
I want to come back to the title of this, the role of government in the modern economy. We spoke to you a couple of years back, kind of at the beginning of the pandemic, about a month or two after most countries had started locking down and that type of thing. And you talked about kind of inequality in the pandemic. But looking back now after 2 years, I wonder if you could just give your reflections on how the pandemic has changed the role of government, or how we understand the role of government in the modern economy, just as a result of that in particular. Because I think we saw in Australia, our Conservative government implemented, after a big campaign by the unions, a wage subsidy scheme, for example, that would have been unheard of kind of 6 months prior to that. What do we know about, what have we learned during the pandemic about that role of government in the economy?
Well, I do hope we've learned some lessons, and some of the lesson go to what should happen before a pandemic. A good government helps you prepare for crises, and we in the United States had a preparedness office within the White House for preparedness for pandemics, because it was so clear after SARS and MERS we were going to have another pandemic, and it was clear. And the question was, were we prepared? Interesting thing is, Trump disbanded that. He said, no, who cares about a pandemic? So we took that away. Another example of preparedness is stockpiles. You want to have stockpiles of masks. Normally you don't need them, but you want to have
them when you get them.
And so he let those stockpiles erode. So when it hit with suddenness, we didn't have any masks, we didn't have any protective gear. We lost the ability to produce them. We have a very good institution. You're talking about institutions. Called the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, which is important in studying and controlling contagious diseases. He defunded that. And so, and that meant key personnel had left. It wasn't the robust institution. We had trained people all over, created institutions all over the world, and he defunded it. So they still are not up to the capacity that we needed. Fourth example, our hospitals prided themselves on having no spare beds. We were using every bed. It's like cars without a spare tire. And
they were efficient.
Very efficient, except when you have a flat tire. And hospitals with no spare beds are fine as long as you don't have a surge. But we had no capacity. And we've shifted people to old age home where they died. And that's why we had more than 1 million Americans die in the pandemic because of the lack of preparedness. So that's the beginning of being prepared. It's a responsibility of government. But the second thing is, as you said, is the response to the crisis. If we had not had government action, the unemployment rate would have soared. There would have been people who literally would have been starving, no income. And we don't have, unlike Australia, we don't have really a basic framework of support. So it would have been literally a disaster. And by the way, the fact that we in the United States responded so strongly was one of the reasons why our GDP did not go down as much as many other countries did. But we didn't have, one of the issues is how much you spend, and the other issue is how you spend it and how you shape your programs. One of the things that we made a very big mistake on is that we didn't try to keep workers connected with their firms. Many European governments, and I think you did that, had a program that was designed to keep workers connected with their employer. One of the consequences of the fact that we didn't do that is that many workers lost all loyalty to their firm. And now in the United States, a lot of people have just dropped out of the labor force. We have a very low unemployment rate. People talk about that. But what they don't talk about is our employment rate is also very low. And we're just getting back to the level of employment that we had before the pandemic, even though in the meanwhile, of course, normally population growth would have led to 2-3% more workers working in the labor force. And many people have gone into self-employment because they say, I don't want to work for an employer who treats me so badly. And that connection with the workplace has really been eroded. So we didn't design a program, but it is very clear that both in preparation and in response, the government was absolutely critical. I mean, just think for a moment where we would be if the government hadn't stepped in. And finally, the disease would have ravaged us far more if we didn't have the vaccines and if we didn't have the public health measures that we took. Who created the vaccines? Let's be clear, it was government. The platform, mRNA vaccine, it was supported by government. The government spent billions of dollars making sure that this platform got adapted to this particular disease. The private sector did put in money. It was minuscule compared to what the public sector put in. So the bottom line is the response to the pandemic in terms of health was also crucially shaped by government. So I got to say, it was a moment of collective action. It worked. And I hope that's the lesson that we take out of this pandemic.
And when it hit, of course, when the COVID hit Australia, I assume it was the same in the US, no one went, oh, there's a big problem, the market will fix this. Like no one thought for a minute that market solutions would get us through. Everyone turns to their government in a crisis.
Exactly. And no one said, oh, we can't afford to respond. They all said, we will do what it takes to address this COVID-19, both in terms of health and in terms of the economy.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much. What a fantastic discussion, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, and thank you to Richard Dennis as well. Thank you everyone who has attended today. Thanks for all your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free to the public and available on our YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Professor Joseph Stiglitz is at Joseph E. Stiglitz, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. Our podcast producer is Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.